Hey, really nice to have you here. This is the last hike. In this video, I'm going through the story of a hiker who mistook determination for resilience and pushed herself far beyond what her body could safely handle.
Her final push toward the summit would end in one of the most preventable tragedies the mountain can produce. It was the 19th of July 2016. Half Dome rises 8,839 feet above sea level in Yosemite National Park, California. Reaching the summit and returning requires a hike of more than 14 miles, with nearly 4,800 feet of elevation gain along the way. The final stretch is the section most people recognize from photographs. Hikers must climb a steep granite face using two steel cables permanently anchored into the rock. There are no ropes or harnesses provided. By that point, reaching the summit depends entirely on a hiker's strength, balance, and whatever energy remains after the long climb to get there. Nevaeh Corin was 28 years old and lived in Sacramento, about 3 hours from the park. She worked as a dental hygienist at a small private practice and spent most of her free time outdoors. When the weather was good, she was usually on a trail somewhere, whether it was a day hike, a camping trip, or a long walk through the foothills near her apartment. She was not training for a major event or chasing personal records. She simply enjoyed being outside. Some hikes were with friends, while others were solo trips on familiar routes.
I've wondered if part of the appeal was the contrast, since her weekdays were spent indoors under bright lights and fixed schedules, while a trail offered space, quiet, and a chance to slow down.
Half Dome had been on her list for a while. Not in a vague, someday kind of way. She and her close friend Mara had actually talked about it seriously, looked up the permit system, read through trail guides. It had been a plan for about a year, something they kept almost doing and then not doing, which had turned into a bit of a joke between them. The summer of 2016 was the year they were actually going to follow through. The Half Dome permit lottery is competitive. It opens months in advance, spots fill within hours, and most people don't get through on the first try. Nevaeh applied and got 2 permits, both for July 19th. That felt like a sign. Then, about 3 weeks before the date, Mara's mother had a medical episode that required her to travel out of state. The trip was off for her. She told Nevaeh to go without her. "Don't let the permits expire," she said. Nevaeh went back and forth on it for a few days. The permits were date-specific. There was no moving them to a better weekend, no transferring them to someone else. It was July 19th, or it was nothing. She had done solo hikes before, nothing this long, but she knew how to read a trail and she felt prepared. She decided to go. In the 2 weeks leading up to the hike, she did 2 preparation hikes, one about 7 miles in the foothills east of Sacramento, and one closer to the Sierra Nevada, roughly 10 miles. Both went well. She bought a new pair of trail shoes a week out, and wore them on the second prep hike to break them in.
The night before she left, she packed her day pack, a 2-liter hydration bladder filled to capacity, 2 granola bars, a bag of trail mix, sunscreen, a light jacket, her phone, and her permit.
She didn't carry a water filter or extra bottles. She drove to Yosemite Valley that evening and checked into a campground inside the park. That night, the campground was loud. July in Yosemite is peak season. The place was nearly full, and groups at neighboring sites were still up late, talking, cooking, and letting their kids run between tents. For most of them, the next day would probably be a short walk to a viewpoint or an afternoon by the river. Nevaeh, meanwhile, was getting ready for one of the longest and most demanding hikes she had ever attempted.
Campgrounds have a way of making strangers feel like they're all sharing the same experience, even when they're there for completely different reasons.
A heat advisory had been issued for the region that evening, covering the central Sierra Nevada and the surrounding foothills. The warning appeared across weather apps, online alerts, and information boards throughout the park. Forecasts called for unusually high temperatures across the mountains the following day. Heat advisories are easy to associate with cities and valleys, but they matter in places like this, too. Half Dome sits at high elevation, yet much of the route is exposed to direct sunlight, with long stretches offering little shade and no access to water. She was on the trail before 5:15 inches the morning. Before she left the campground, she sent Mara a text. It was short, something along the lines of, "Heading out now, wish you were here." Mara was in another state, dealing with her family. She didn't see the message until several hours later.
The trip they had talked about for months would ultimately become a story that Mara had to hear from someone else.
The trailhead parking lot was already partially full when she arrived. A few groups were gearing up in the dark headlamps clipped to packs, the quiet sound of zippers and boots on asphalt, someone going over a checklist in a low voice. Most of the people starting at that hour knew exactly what they were doing. Starting before sunrise on a summer day in Yosemite isn't just a preference, it's the difference between finishing in manageable heat and finishing in something else entirely. Nevaeh starting before 5:15 a.m. was the right call. By every early indicator, she was doing this correctly. The first section of the hike follows the Mist Trail, a steep, well-worn path that climbs past Vernal Fall through more than 600 stone steps cut directly into the granite. In the early morning, the trail is cool and partially shaded, and the spray from the falls drifts across the path in a fine mist that soaks your clothes and keeps the air noticeably cold. It's physically demanding even at that hour. The steps are uneven, slick in places, and they just keep going, but it's also the most forgiving stretch of the entire hike. There's water everywhere, the air is cool, your legs are fresh. Nevaeh moved through it steadily. She passed a couple coming down from an overnight camp. They mentioned it was going to be a hot one and that they were glad to be heading out early. She agreed and kept moving. By the time she cleared the upper falls and the trail leveled briefly before the next climb, she had been hiking for a little over 2 hours and felt strong. That part is important. She felt strong. The hike, up to that point, was going exactly the way it was supposed to go. She reached Nevada Fall, roughly 5.5 miles, in and around 5,900 feet of elevation, sometime around 740 inches the morning. She stopped for about 10 minutes, found a spot near the viewpoint, and ate half a granola bar while looking out over the falls. Nearby, a father and his teenage son were taking a break of their own, eating breakfast and studying a trail map spread across their laps. After a few minutes, they struck up a conversation and asked whether she was heading all the way to the summit. When she said she was, the father mentioned that he had completed the hike a few years earlier. According to him, the cables looked intimidating in photos, but they felt even steeper once you were actually standing on them.
At the time, it was just a brief conversation during a rest stop. Neither of them had any reason to think they'd be among the last people to see her doing well.
She took a photo before leaving the light still low and golden across the fall, the mist catching it. It was time-stamped. She was already roughly a third through her water. That's not alarming on its own. 2.5 hours of hiking, some of it steep. In warming air, a third of 2 liters is about what you'd expect. The problem wasn't what she had used. It was what she had left and how much trail was still ahead of her. That feeling at Nevada Fall, strong, ahead of schedule, comfortable, is worth paying attention to, because it doesn't just describe how she felt in that moment. It becomes the reference point she measures everything against for the rest of the hike. 2 hours later, when her legs are heavier and her head is starting to ache, the comparison isn't to some objective standard of how she should feel, it's to how good she felt at Nevada Fall. And compared to that, everything else just feels like normal fatigue, like the hike doing what hikes do. She left Nevada Fall and kept going. One thing no trail guide fully prepares you for is what the heat on open granite actually feels like once you're in it. You can read about sun exposure and elevation and lack of shade, but the experience of standing on a pale rock face with heat coming from above and radiating back from below is something that only registers when you're already there. The trail above Nevada Fall moves through a stretch of forest before the trees begin to thin. It happens gradually, the pines spacing out, the undergrowth pulling back, patches of open granite appearing between the trees, and then at some point the last of the shade just ends. The trail opens onto wide granite slabs and the sky takes over. No canopy, no shadow, nothing between you and the sun. The air temperature had already climbed well past 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and the rock was radiating heat from below to match it. From up there, you can see for miles the valley floor far below, the surrounding peaks, the sheer scale of the landscape in every direction. It looks manageable from up there. The distances flatten out. The summit doesn't look far. That's not a comfort, it's a trick the terrain plays on you, and it works on almost everyone.
The dangerous thing about commitment is that it accumulates slowly, and by this point, turning around would have felt far more difficult than it sounds.
The first rest stop came somewhere on the open switchbacks. She stopped, hands on her knees, breathing steadier than her legs felt. Started again after a minute or two. A mild headache had settled in somewhere above her eyes, the kind that's easy to put down to squinting in bright light or the altitude or just the effort of the climb. She noted it and kept going. Somewhere further up the exact point, isn't clear she noticed the hydration bladder was lighter than she expected. Not close to empty, but lighter than it should have been for where she was on the trail. She had been drinking steadily without really tracking it, and the reservoir had dropped faster than her pace suggested it should. She was still a significant distance from the summit.
The calculation she would have made in that moment was probably something like this: I'm more than halfway there. I've been moving well. I can manage what's left. The kind of reasoning that makes sense when quitting feels worse than carrying on.
At some point on that stretch, she noticed the amount of water other hikers were carrying. Large bottles clipped to backpacks, hydration reservoirs with tubes running across their chests, extra supplies tucked into side pockets. Early in a hike, details like that barely register. But here's the thing, when your own supply is running low, trust me, it's hard not to compare what you're carrying to what everyone else has. The second rest stop came not long after. She stopped again, this time sitting briefly on a flat section of rock. The headache was still there, slightly more present than before, sitting behind her eyes rather than above them. She drank the last meaningful amount of water she had and stood back up. The trail ahead was still exposed, still climbing, still offering nothing in the way of relief. Around mid-morning, she reached a flat section of trail a little over a mile below the subdome. A group of 3 hikers heading down passed her. They had already been up to the cables and knew how hot the upper trail had become. One of them slowed when he saw her sitting on a rock in the sun, shoulders slumped, a nearly empty water bottle resting in her lap. He asked if she was doing okay. Nevaeh said she was just taking a break. The hiker mentioned that temperatures were climbing quickly and that there was still a fair amount of trail ahead. She thanked him, rested for another minute, then got back on her feet and continued upward. The trail between that point and the subdome doesn't give you anything. No shade, no water, no flat ground, just a steady upward grind across open granite with the heat coming from above and reflecting back from below. Other hikers were still visible ahead and behind, which made continuing feel like the normal thing to do. When the people around you are still moving upward, stopping feels like the unusual choice. You calibrate your sense of what's acceptable based on what everyone else is doing. Nobody around her was turning back. By the time she reached the base of the subdome, she had been hiking for more than 5 hours. Temperatures had climbed into the low 90s, and her water supply was nearly gone. At most, she had a few small mouthfuls left. The summit was closer than it had ever been. She kept going. This part made me wonder, did it still feel like a challenge at that point? Or had she already shifted into that stubborn mindset where the only thing that mattered was reaching the end? Sometime around 10:30 inches the morning, she began climbing the subdome steps. If the trail up to that point had been hard, the subdome was something different. It's roughly 600 feet of near vertical exposed granite, steep enough that there are fixed handrails bolted into the rock, steep enough that you're using your hands as much as your legs. In reasonable conditions, with water and energy, it's demanding, but manageable.
But let me tell you, in low 90s heat, after 5 hours of climbing with almost nothing left to drink, each step up those stairs takes a little more out of you.
She was moving slowly, one hand on the railing, pausing every few steps to let her breathing settle. At the top of the subdome, just before the cables begin, there's a point where rangers or trail volunteers check permits before allowing hikers onto the face. Someone saw her there, looked at her face, checked her card, waved her through. A routine interaction, unremarkable, over in seconds. She continued to the cable base and sat down on the granite. She wasn't in shade. Over the next several minutes, she finished the last of her water, taking a few small sips until the hydration bladder was empty. Nearby, 2 hikers were preparing for the cables, adjusting gloves, and making final checks before beginning the climb. One of them noticed Nevaeh sitting on the granite, looking up toward the summit. She wasn't talking, she wasn't moving much, but neither of those things would have stood out in a place like this. Plenty of hikers stop at the base of the cables to rest and mentally prepare before heading up. The 2 hikers eventually began their ascent. Before she stood up, she took a photo pointing upward at the cables, the summit visible above them, the granite face in full midday sun. It was the last photo on her phone. Her permit was still clipped to the outside of her pack. She was out of water, but she started the cables anyway. Here's what the cables actually look like up close. 2 parallel steel cables anchored into the granite face, with wooden foot rungs bolted into the rock about every 10 feet. The angle averages around 45 degrees, but steepens in sections. You face the rock, grip both cables, and step upward rung by rung. Most hikers wear gloves, the cables and rungs have been in direct sun for hours by mid-morning, and the metal gets hot enough that bare hands become a problem on a long ascent. The east-facing granite was in full direct sun. There was no wind. Heat was coming from above, through the sun, from the rock face directly in front of her, and from the rungs and cables under her hands and feet. There was no direction that wasn't hot. If there's one thing this story reinforced for me, it's that heat doesn't need to feel dramatic to be dangerous. She moved slowly from the start. A solo hiker who began the cables a few minutes behind her kept a comfortable distance and watched her go one rung at a time, pausing between steps, movements deliberate but increasingly labored. He didn't think it was unusual. The cables are hard. The heat was obvious to everyone on the face. The summit was visible from the moment she started climbing. From the base, it looks achievable. As you get higher, it gets closer in a way that feels like progress even when your body is telling you something different. 2/3 of the way up, the top is roughly 120 feet away. That's closer than the base is. At that point, going up and going down are almost the same distance, except going up ends at the summit and going down ends where you already were. About 2/3 of the way up, somewhere around 260 to 280 feet above the base, she stopped. Both hands remained on the cable, but she wasn't climbing anymore. The hiker behind her waited for a moment, assuming she was just taking a break. After a while, he asked whether she wanted him to pass. There was no real response. She turned her head slightly in his direction, but otherwise stayed where she was. That's when he realized something wasn't right, and started climbing up to her. Her grip on the cable was loose, with her fingers curled around it more than actually holding it. Her face was deeply flushed, the redness extending from her cheeks down into her neck. What stood out most, though, was her skin. It was dry. Not damp, not sweaty, just dry, in the middle of a near vertical climb in 4-degree heat. When he asked her name, she answered, but slowly, with noticeable pauses, like she had to think about it before saying it. He asked if she had any water left. After a short pause, she said she was out.
Genuinely had a lot of respect for what he did next. He handed her what remained in his bottle. She took a few small drinks, less than half of what he offered.
When he told her they needed to get her down, she didn't object. But it quickly became clear that she wasn't moving normally anymore. Her legs still worked, but she seemed unable to coordinate what they were supposed to do. Every step had to be guided, almost like she was following instructions rather than making the movements herself. Getting someone in that condition down the cables was not a simple task. Descending meant facing the rock, stepping backward, and maintaining a grip on both cables at the same time. Even under normal circumstances, it could feel awkward. With someone who could no longer reliably direct their own movements, it became far more difficult. He positioned himself directly above Nevaeh, keeping one hand on the cable and the other near her shoulder while guiding her through each step. A woman who had been climbing behind them noticed what was happening, turned around, and began helping as well. She stayed below Nevaeh, helping guide her feet onto each wooden rung. For the next stretch of the descent, the three of them worked their way down the cables together. There was no specialized equipment and no real plan beyond getting her safely back to the bottom. They simply adapted to the situation in front of them, one careful step at a time. It took somewhere between 35 and 40 minutes to bring her from her position on the cables to the base of the subdome. Every minute of that descent, the sun was on all of them. By the time she reached the flat area at the bottom, she couldn't stand without support. She was lowered to the ground, her skin was hot and dry to the touch, her breathing was rapid and shallow. She was conscious, but not responding to most questions. The hiker who had been behind her on the cables managed to find a single bar of cell service. He placed a call shortly after noon, but it dropped before he could finish. He tried again. That call dropped too. A few minutes later, a third attempt finally connected. He reported an unresponsive woman near the base of the cables and gave the best description of their location that he could. A helicopter was sent from a facility roughly 40 miles away. Then there was nothing left to do but wait.
I've always thought that waiting might be the cruelest part of an emergency, knowing help is on the way, but having no idea whether it'll arrive soon or not soon enough.
The two hikers moved her to the only shade they could find, a shallow rock overhang barely wide enough to offer any meaningful relief. It blocked the direct sunlight, but the granite beneath her had been absorbing heat since morning and was still radiating it back into the air. They poured the little water they had left over her neck and forearms. At some point, another hiker stopped, took one look at the situation, and handed over a small bottle of water without being asked. It wasn't enough to change much, and everyone there probably understood that. More hikers passed through during the wait. Some stopped briefly to ask whether help was on the way before continuing down the trail. There wasn't much anyone could do. Nevaeh was no longer speaking. Her eyes occasionally followed movement, but she wasn't responding to her name. The two hikers who had brought her down the cables stayed beside her, doing what they could with the limited shade and water available.
Those two strangers could have continued their day, but instead they chose to share the burden of someone else's worst one.
The next 70 minutes would test the limits of what compassion alone could accomplish. The helicopter arrived and landed on a flat granite shelf about 200 feet from her position. Her core temperature, measured on scene, was 106.1 degrees Fahrenheit. She was carried to the aircraft on a litter. She did not regain consciousness during transport. Nevaeh Corin was pronounced dead that afternoon. Below, on the trail, the day continued. Other hikers were still on the cables, still coming up from the subdome, still making their way down from the summit. The helicopter would have been visible to some of them, a brief interruption in the sky above the dome. Most of them wouldn't have known what it was for. By the time the last hikers cleared the trail that evening, the only sign that anything had happened was a car still sitting in the trailhead parking lot after dark. The autopsy was completed 2 days later. The cause of death was exertional heat stroke. In plain terms, the body regulates its internal temperature through sweating. During prolonged exertion in extreme heat, if fluid loss outpaces intake, that system begins to fail. The body stops cooling itself, core temperature rises. Past a certain threshold, organs begin to sustain damage from the heat directly: the liver, the kidneys, eventually the brain. It doesn't happen suddenly. It builds over hours, quietly, while the person is still moving and still making decisions. The visible signs show up late. By the time someone looks obviously wrong, the process has usually been underway for a long time.
The autopsy revealed liver cell death and kidney damage consistent with severe heat stroke and prolonged physical exertion, while toxicology results were negative and no underlying medical conditions were identified.
Based on the time-stamped photos, the empty hydration bladder, and her recorded temperature at rescue, the medical examiner estimated she had likely crossed into the critical phase somewhere around the time she started the cables, possibly earlier, on the final stretch of the upper trail. The 70-minute wait for the helicopter was within normal parameters for that terrain and distance. It was also, by that point, almost certainly beyond the window where intervention would have changed what happened. Her belongings were collected and returned to her next of kin. Mara was notified that night. The case was closed as an accidental death.